and we wanted to get started with how did we get here, right? Like, where did this report come from? What happened 3 years ago? What's been happening? How did this report come to be? And so I'll pass it over to Lola and to you, Steve, to give us a little bit of that background.
Sure, I can start. I'm going to have to read some of the dates because there's a whole lot here, and I want to make sure I get it right. So on August 5th, the DOJ announced that the Special Litigation Section of their Civil Rights Division was going to launch a pattern or practice investigation into the city of Phoenix and the Phoenix Police Department. The DOJ had the nerve to reach out to our community on August 9th. Most of us know that that is the anniversary of Mike Brown's murder in Ferguson. Also the anniversary of the violent arrests in front of the police department with protesters that we heard from today at our press conference and others who were violently arrested. And so they had the nerve to announce their investigation to the community on that very same day. DOJ came to Phoenix after the Maricopa County Attorney's Office and the Phoenix Police Department were exposed in a colossal scandal that resulted in multiple resignations of prosecutors and of city officials. Attorneys were disbarred, politicians stepped down. It was a disaster for the city, a disaster for the county, and at the center of all of it was political prosecutions from the 2020 protests for Black Lives. While the protests were what prompted the DOJ investigation, the DOJ also announced that they were here to investigate other things. So in whole, their investigation was to include or to conclude whether or not Phoenix PD used excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. It was also here to investigate whether PPD engages in discriminatory policing practices that violate the Constitution and federal law, whether PPD violates the First Amendment by retaliating against individuals who are engaged in protected speech and expressive activities, i.e. protests, and whether the city and Phoenix PD respond to people with disabilities in a manner that violates the ADA. That includes decisions whether or not to detain individuals with behavioral health disabilities, and whether Phoenix PD violates those who are experiencing homelessness by seizing and disposing of their belongings in a manner that violates the Constitution. And it's important to take note that the DOJ did not include the Maricopa County Attorney's Office in its investigation of the First Amendment violations, despite the fact that Maricopa County Attorney's Office was at the center of the scandal, so much so that the county attorney herself ends up resigning not long after the DOJ investigation was launched. That was in around March of 2022. And that wasn't a mistake or an oversight. That was intentional. We're confident of that in our movement. So after nearly 3 years of its investigation, the DOJ issued a report last Thursday, and the DOJ itself called that report historic and severe. And frankly, this could be the worst DOJ report that we've all seen in American history. And that is not an exaggeration. That is what people are saying, experts are saying. But what's interesting about the report is that it contains nothing new. Nothing that our community organizations hadn't already told the DOJ before they got here, nothing that our community hadn't already exposed. For example, the report states that Phoenix Police Department is racist and violent. Check the social media of BLM Phx Metro. Check the social media of Poder in Action. Check the social media of Mass Labazy. How many years have we all been saying that? Not just us. There's community organizations logged in here tonight who've been saying that as well. Check out your local movement. That is not news. And it's really wild that the community, or I'm sorry, the city completely obstructed the DOJ investigation. You're going to hear about how the DOJ investigation, they say the city is saying that they fully cooperated. However, they withheld materials. They hired lawyers to file protective orders to prevent releases of information. They refused the DOJ access to depositions. They allowed its police officers to decline to participate in the investigation. They just choose not to. And the city spent over $1 million handling the investigation. You don't spend $1 million to cooperate. And it's also really important for us to recognize too, DOJ investigations are really rare. Steve educated me on this morning. What they're actually, and we mentioned this at the press conference, there are over 18,000 police departments in the US, and the DOJ has only investigated 71 of them. And that's over the course of 30 years that DOJ has been conducting these types of investigations. That's less than half of a 1%. And of those investigations, only 41 has resulted in a consent decree or any form of litigation. And so, Steve, can you tell us a little bit about what a consent decree is? Because I know that that terminology is kind of misleading and it's new to some of us. So, what is it?
Sure. A consent decree is an agreement between the DOJ and the department they're investigating. It's essentially a settlement agreement of the DOJ's either active or potential prosecution. The idea here is the DOJ has the same rights of any other litigant in the civil litigation process. They can file a lawsuit, and a consent decree is a settlement like someone that might be involved in a car crash will settle with an insurance company. The difference with a consent decree that differentiates it from any other type of settlement agreement is court oversight. So as the consent decree itself is actually issued by the court, it's agreed to by the parties, the court signs off on it, it becomes part of the case, and then typically and almost always the court will appoint what's called an independent monitor, which will be someone who's hired specifically to just oversee the consent decree. One interesting aside, the independent monitor in the New York stop and frisk case back from 10, 15 years ago is a guy named Richard Jerome. He was also the lead investigator on the 21CP investigation of the City of Phoenix Police Department, the one that the DOJ does not want anyone to see, or excuse me, the City of Phoenix does not want the DOJ or anyone else to see. So that's an example of an independent monitor that oversees the consent decree. The unique nature of consent decrees is they can be enforced by the federal court. So they set forth a specific number of terms. They're very lengthy. I just finished today reading the one with Baltimore PD, which was like, I think, 71 pages. All laid out in terms of what needs to happen, the additional training, the additional reform measures that are supposed to happen according to what the city and the DOJ agree to. And then if the city is not on the timeline, if they do not do what they're supposed to do, the monitor can go back to the court and request compliance, which can include things like sanctions, can include things like injunctions, basically the power of the federal court to enforce the agreement. The alternative to a consent decree is called a memorandum of agreement. That's essentially the same thing, but without court oversight. So it's just an agreement between the DOJ and a police department. So you can imagine how those typically turn out. And then the alternative to either one of those things is litigation. That's where the DOJ will go in and treat the case how we treat all of our cases, only with presumably the resources of the federal government. So they will actually litigate a pattern and practice case against the city of Phoenix. There will be no qualified immunity because there is no qualified immunity as to patterns and practices. And that case will proceed until the city agrees, most likely to a consent decree. We generally don't see memorandums of agreement in cases with misconduct alleged as substantially as what's been alleged by the DOJ here and what we've all been seeing for decades.
Thanks, Steve. I know one of the things that we wanted to talk about is the possibility of our movement being opposed to the consent decree. So community and community groups are working through the tensions right now, trying to understand what do we want. Like when we're talking about police accountability, we want police accountability, but we don't trust police. We don't trust the government to get us there. The abolitionist critiques of consent decrees are based on the fact that consent decrees are reforms and have extremely limited effectiveness. In order for a consent decree to be compatible with abolition, it would need to be effective, it would need to be long lasting, it needs to be a gateway to abolition. And it must never be a reform that expands the power of the police to do harm. It can't ever expand a police budget. It can't ever provide tools for the police or help the police continue to do their work. So it means that we can't support better disciplinary measures, revised use of force policies, new community policing departments, because those reforms don't advance abolition. They instead reinforce police departments as having a place in our society to protect us and keep us safe. So to our knowledge, at least at MassLib, there has never in history been an abolitionist consent decree. All consent decrees have been reformist in nature. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's actually unpack the report a bit so that we can get clear on what the DOJ is saying. One of the questions we wanted to answer tonight here in this public forum is, how did the report compare to what we were actually expecting? So BLM, Poder, let's hop in, let's talk about it. How's it different than we expected it to be?
I can jump in. I mean, it's not different from what was expected. I think, what you shared. I wanted to kind of dive into kind of what are some of the things that we saw, and kind of summary of some of those areas of this report. So, and we talked about these 5 areas that got investigated. And then in the middle of the report, there was another area that got added in some ways that you see now, the report around the treatment of minors and the treatment of youth, right? So on one end, right, it says that Phoenix police, what we've been saying is violent as fuck, and use extreme excessive use of force. Not only are they shooting and killing people at extremely high rates, but also using their less lethal weapons in extremely violent and lethal ways as well. We're seeing that they are escalating situations, right? That is on the report as well. Some of the takeaways, that they use violence to, quote, like supposedly de-escalate, and do have made choices that put them, put our community in harm's way. We heard in the press conference, right, this idea of like they are being, this policy of use it or lose it. If they're not using their weapons, like they're getting reprimanded, cops are getting reprimanded for not using weapons, right? So that was on one end around like the excessive use of force. Then, you know, the report is also very clear what community orgs and people have been saying for a long time. This department actively is discriminating against Black, Brown, Indigenous people. And it was interesting actually that there wasn't a racial breakdown of a lot of the categories on excessive use of force or different things, but there was a racial breakdown, around some, like, how are they implementing minor infractions. So they only looked at, the DOJ report looked at some of the areas of where discrimination is happening, but we know that this is pervasive in everything that the department does. But some numbers that you'll see and wanted to know is, right, one of the numbers is that Black drivers are 144% more likely than white drivers to be cited or arrested for minor, citation violations. 144%, which is like, I mean, everyone knows that, but it's like to have those numbers, again, for people that are saying it's not happening. Indigenous people are 44 times more likely than white people to be cited or arrested for consumption or like drinking alcohol in public spaces. And brown people are 12 times more likely than white people to be cited or arrested for things like tinted windows. And so when you see this, and you also see the, discriminatory and really fucked up anti-immigrant legislation that is being pushed, at the state, like HCR 2060, like we're talking about, not only are cops doing this, but there's also, they're getting more tools, more policies, more laws to continue to do this in a very legal way. And so even with all of this information, Phoenix police continue to deny that they're a racist police department. So that is on one end. The next thing I wanted to kind of touch on is, that it's not new because of the work of mass liberation and also the reporting on ABC 15, right? But that Phoenix police violates the rights of protesters and retaliates against people that they think are anti-police or who are anti-cop or who are saying things that they don't like, right? And so a few years ago in 2017, right, when there was a rally against Trump, when Trump was pardoning Arpaio, we had a huge peaceful protest outside, and out of nowhere, a lot of y'all were probably there. Phoenix PD escalated, gassed people, geared up against community, hurt a lot of people, right? And in 2017, they created a coin, right, a memorandum coin that we've seen around, where they were celebrating the fact that they had harmed, one of the peaceful protesters. And so that's, again, as it's not new, but it has been continuous, and there's several examples. But again, like that piece specifically, I think what came out of the political prosecutions and even more data to, the press conference this morning, like the way that they were not only hurting and harming people, but actively trying to ruin people's lives. And in many ways did, right, to some folks. The next area, right, that you talked about is that, and we're seeing that the city of Phoenix is targeting unsheltered community, illegally detaining people, citing, arresting, throwing away personal belongings. And we heard, even in that press conference, right, like not only unconstitutional, but also inhumane, which is like wild for me to kind of hear that from them, from police themselves, right? But that is the reality. And again, if you don't follow, or you should follow Unsheltered Phoenix, right, who have been documenting the violence and the abuse from the Phoenix Police Department to our unsheltered community. So the city continues to lie that they're meeting people, that they're giving people resources. Um, Not true, but also, right, like the data that is showing the level of violence. The next area, right, that we wanted to note is another takeaway, that the Phoenix Police Department is actively against discriminating, and the city against people with behavioral health disabilities and issues. And so with that, there was definitely a lot of community that reached out about that reality of like calling the departments because they didn't know who else to call to ask for help because their children needed help. And then the result was, even when they were calling and actively asking for help, the result ended like with their son's life being taken. And so this was definitely a point of a lot of just harm, right? And this report continues to relive this trauma for a lot of families. So in this, right, the report, they kind of talk about that this is about bad training, right? That's one of the things though that was interesting, right? So they kind of say that the problem with this is that cops need to be trained better. And so we just want to reiterate that is not the case, right? The problem is the police. That is what the problem is. And we've seen training upon training throughout the year since, we saw a huge shift in 2016 after they killed Michelle Clouseau. I think it was 14 actually. And we've continued to have this reality. And so again, right, the police should have no role in responding to people with mental health crisis. And then the last piece that they added, which is really critical to us, is that the Phoenix Police Department has no clear protocols, and they're treating with minors, and they're treating minors and young people in the same abusive, violent ways, causing harm on their mental health and physical health. And like some of those examples that were extremely, just again, realities to see. But this report in this section specifically, I think for anyone that's watching that works at schools, that is a school board member, that works within policy, school jurisdictions, is that this should be a wake-up call that police have no role in our schools, and that police should not be near young people, should not be near students, should not be actively being put in place. So just that reiteration, right? Cops belong nowhere near our education system. So again, these were all things that we already knew, but it doesn't make them any less fucked up and any like less just like really hard for other families as they read and they hear, because they're seeing and hearing their experiences throughout this. So there's just a lot of examples, 125 pages, a lot of examples of violence, of racism, and of lies. And for the families, right, a lot of families have said, at the end of the day, this is just a report. We already knew this, and like how dare they look into this report, say they violated my kid's constitutional rights, and then we still have no accountability. These cops are still on the streets. They are still defending this. They're still, dehumanizing their loved ones. Like the media continues to do that. And so no accountability has come from this. And so with that, I wanted to, like, that was kind of, again, no, not a surprises, but I wanted to go over some of those kind of things that stood out to us. But yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Go. Like, what are some of the things for you that you all saw?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think that actually leads really well into what really stood out for us. As BLM, we've been working with the family for Jacob Harris, and his friends' families as well. And Jacob Harris was a young black boy who was murdered by the police in 2019. And the DOJ highlighted this case in their report multiple times throughout the report, basically stating that it was one of the most egregious violations that they'd ever seen. And and yet there's no calls for any sort of accountability from the police officers who murdered him. And Jacob Harris lost his life, but his three friends who were with him are now sitting in prison for the murder of Jacob Harris, because this the police officers involved in this situation, used the felony murder law that is still active in Arizona to basically um, pin the murder on his friends who were present with him the night of his murder. And so his three friends, who were all underage at the time, are now serving life in prison for a murder that the Phoenix Police Department committed. And the DOJ has highlighted this, like I said, in their report multiple times throughout. And per usual, the Phoenix Police Department is kind of just sweeping under the rug, acting like, well, we already concluded that there was no wrongdoing, and there's no recourse happening. There's nothing being done to take a deeper look into the case, to reopen the case, to free Johnny, Jeremiah, or Soraya, who are currently sitting in prison right now. And so, that just kind of speaks to the deeper issue around the lack of accountability that the Phoenix Police Department has, right? They continue to investigate themselves and continue to get away with these types of harms, these egregious harms, and these egregious violations of civil rights, of human rights. And there is zero accountability happening on the other end. And the Department of Justice is no better. They're also, yes, they're a federal government agency over all of these police departments, who have the authority over these police departments, and yet they are also just an arm of the state, right? They're also just sweeping it under the rug, like, oh, well, that happened back then, so there's nothing we can do about it now, right? So they're not taking there's no accountability happening. And so that was kind of really what stood out for us. And so, and I think I can get into more of that a little bit later in terms of like what it looks like to get involved, because there is a campaign. We are definitely working to make sure that reopen the case to free these young individuals from prison. And there's an active campaign going, so there's a way to get involved in that. And so we can go over that later, what that looks like. But this is the families have never received any sort of support. There's no type of, and that's the thing about what's happening with the police brutality in Phoenix, is that these families who are losing their loved ones to the state are victims, and yet they're being treated as not as victims. They're being treated as criminals, as whatever the state is seeing them as, and they're not being given any resources. They're not being given any sort of support to help them move through the grief that they're feeling. There's nothing offered. They're not returning their property. I think Jacob Harris is still, or maybe just recently, either still waiting or just recently got his loved ones. Not Jacob Harris, I'm sorry, Roland Harris just recently got his belongings back, or maybe is still waiting for his belongings. I'm not quite sure where we're at in that process, but it's been 5 years now, right? And families have been waiting for years to get their property back from their loved ones, and sometimes it's the last thing that they have to remind themselves of that person on the day that they were murdered, right? And they're being treated as though it's just like an annoyance, I guess you could say, by the police department. And so again, these are just further instances of how the Phoenix Police Department continues to abuse the power that they've been given. And with that, I'll pass it back to whoever goes next.
Steve, if you want to go, what are some of the takeaways?
Yeah, there were a lot of takeaways, and I think Vidi and Glo did a great job of covering them. One that you mentioned, Glow, was the police investigate themselves. And that was one of the big things that jumped out to me, which we've all known. I see intimately in these civil rights cases we litigate, is they don't do investigations at all internally at Phoenix Police. Probably not many places, but certainly not in this department. I pulled up the numbers. This was a paragraph that jumped out at me. The DOJ report specifically said that Phoenix PD supervisors in 2021 and 2022 determined that 98.7% and 99.4% of use of force incidents complied with their policy. And this was a number that really was just, not that I couldn't believe it, but still has me shaking my head. As a result of so much good work that Poder has done, now police have to document when a gun is pointed at somebody, and that's gone on for a couple of years now. So between 2021 and 2022, we had 6,013 incidents of Phoenix police pointing a gun at someone. And in 6,013 incidents, the Phoenix police said that was within policy. Not once in 6,013 times did the Phoenix Police Department conclude that an officer pointed a gun at a civilian that was not within their policy. This was kind of, I wouldn't say it was glossed over, but it was kind of an addition at the end of the report. It got very little media coverage, but I think the lack of investigation, the lack of any accountability within the department is one of the reasons we see this report written the way it is, as scathing as it is. I think these investigators, they couldn't turn a blind eye because there's just zero accountability within this department, as y'all been saying for a long time. And this is federal cops confirming it. So it's not like these are, radical leftist abolitionists that are doing this investigation. These are two of the largest law enforcement agencies in the world, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice. So
I think, sorry, really quick. The other thing that I'll mention that really stood out is just the lack of inclusion of like what Lola mentioned earlier of MCAO's piece of this in the report. They deliberately chose not to investigate MCAO when being someone who was politically persecuted in 2021 by the Department of Maricopa County Attorney's Office, and who was falsely arrested and falsely accused of being a gang member, who was more deadlier than the Bloods and the Crips, right? Do y'all see me? Do I look dangerous? No. But and so the fact that they and so as I was mentioning earlier, right? Like the DOJ is still an arm of the state, and they can pick and choose what they want to investigate and what they don't want to investigate. And the Maricopa County Attorney's Office is closer to the Federal Bureau of Investigation than the Phoenix Police Department. So it's easy for the DOC to throw the Phoenix Police Department under the rug, but they didn't necessarily want to get into the weeds with the county attorney's office, because then they themselves would have to also be accountable for allowing that to happen. And the fact that they just conveniently decided, well, even though one of our top prosecutors in the country or in the state was disbarred for her egregious and unlawful behavior, we're just going to ignore that and pretend it didn't happen. We're only going to focus on the Phoenix Police Department, which is just like Steve said, it's not surprising, but it just blows my mind to see how deep the corruption goes. It goes all the way up the chain, all the way up to the White House. It goes all the way up.
That's right. It's the students grading themselves too, right? Like we said, that the police policies, everything's within policy because they legalize what they do, right? The DOJ said in its report too that the police, all of the training that they actually train themselves, they call it de-escalation training, is actually escalation training. They've just legalized all of it. And the same thing with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. We're not going to look at the whole picture, because if we look at the whole picture, we'll have to admit to the level of corruption. So we're just not going to look at the whole picture. And this is what we took away too. Everything that Steve, Glow, Vidi has said, we took that away too. We agree with all of it. And I feel like one of the things, the aspects of this report that's most disappointing is that it was the protest cases in 2020 that really lit the fire for these folks to see the smoke to come here to Phoenix. But then they didn't write much about it. And they didn't write much about it because it's the federal government. And like Glo just said, it goes all the way up. And the federal government itself is currently engaged in political prosecutions. And so that's why it's not investigating political prosecutions. You see the Biden-Harris administration is politically prosecuting students and student encampments all across the nation. They're targeting and silencing and caging and killing pro-Palestine protesters. So how could they ever talk about political prosecutions here in Arizona? And they did all this, they launched this investigation before this current uprising for Palestine. And now that that's happening, they don't know what to do with it. So they've left that part of the DOJ report empty. And it was the reason they came. So if we don't see now that this is by design, we never will. I mean, it's very clear. Students grading themselves, they legalize what they want. How could we ever trust them? Right? And that's why our movement doesn't. What about the response from city leadership, PPD and plea? What about that? Like how is it that we are now currently interpreting that? I feel like for Mass Lib, one of the main one of the main takeaways from the way that plea and PPD has been responding is that it's always been a cover up. The entire problem with policing under Mayor Kate Gallego's leadership has always been covered up. And you see it in so many little microaggressions that happen. I know that at one point during all of the times that we were flooding the city council, we at one point saw Kate Gallego change the public comment policy so that we actually couldn't talk anymore. We issued all these citizens petitions, and then she limited the amount of time that people could actually talk because she didn't want to hear it. Like that is just a big part of the cover up. It's always been a cover up. When the community exposed the corruption, the lies, the political prosecutions, the city manager, the mayor, and the police were always scrambling. They didn't want to work and cooperate with the DOJ. We saw how they refused to release the findings of the 21 CP report, the ASU investigations from the 2020 protest cases. We saw how they did a settlement with Chief Kurtenbach so that he wouldn't talk, right? They let him retire, even though he was found to be part of the massive cover up.
Jerry Williams.
Jerry Williams was able to retire early, right? And none of this is a big deal to the DOJ. It's just they allow this cover up to take place, and all they do is just announce in their findings, oh yeah, they didn't cooperate. And it's as if we're supposed to ever, and then the police and plea are talking publicly about how we should be able to handle this problem ourselves. We should be trusted to be able to fix the problems ourselves. It's ludicrous. And when you have a community who is less important than the police's feelings about how this report and how a consent decree could actually operate, it's just where we've lost the plot. Like we completely lost the plot. I don't know. I feel like at this point too, the DOJ has got to. They've already admitted that this is one of the most egregious reports, egregious findings in American history. The DOJ has got to do much more than expect the city to consent. There has to be binding limitations to what the police can do, and we already know the DOJ can't do that. So to come here and say that we're going to have a consent decree, drag us down 20 years of implementation, expanding the police budget, it's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. I'm going to pass it to Glo from BLM. What do you all feel about the police reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not surprised about their reaction. Anytime that they have ever been put in the spotlight for accountability, they've always found a way to wiggle their way out of it. And so I didn't expect anything less from them than to. I mean, I was slightly surprised at the level of boldness they had to, like, 2 hours later just completely come out and already have like a prepared, like they already knew they came out ready and prepared 2 hours later to just boldly and bold face like deny any sort of acceptance of this report, as though, right, I was talking to someone earlier about lying and how I would just appreciate you not saying anything at all than to come out and completely lie and say that it's not true, right? And the fact that they came out, if they had come out and said, well, some of the findings we can agree with, and some of them that we, some of them we completely, disregard as valid and true, I would not have any respect for them still. However, I would be like, well, at least you tried to take accountability, kinda. But the boldness that they had to just say it was 100% a lie is just, it blows my mind. Like, I can I borrow some of that boldness in my own personal life, to be not to lie, not to use it in the way that they use it, but to be bold in the takedown of the state. Like, can I borrow some of that? And so, yeah, so I feel like, as Lola mentioned, like Mayor Kate Gallego, right, enables this behavior. She continues to give a pass. I think I saw in here a comment. Someone mentioned a comment in here about plea helping Jeff Cook, the officer who murdered Ryan Whitaker, right, get off and avoid any accountability in 2020. And those types of things are possible because of the way that the mayor continues to enable this behavior. I know that there was I forget what it was. Someone help me out. There was another issue in 2020, maybe 2021, where Mayor Kate Gallego, there was like, I think it was something to do with the DPS officer. I'm forgetting what it is right now. It'll come back to me. But yeah, so I mean, we definitely weren't surprised that this was their reaction. I think what it does for us, it continues to just enable us and light the fire under our asses to continue to, right, see this train through, because it was because of community power that I am free today. Like, I was facing 10 years in prison because of the bold-faced lies that these officers made against me, right? And the way that they conspired to arrest us and charge us as protesters. And that was one of the lower ends. There were people facing many, many more years than me, but me as a single parent, right, facing 10 years in prison, it was because of the community that came together, because of the organizations here on this live, and many other groups and organizations as well, and people and community members who really helped to stick it to them and to make sure that we were able to uncover all of the bullshit lies and get our freedom back, because we were about to lose our freedom. And so this report, it continues to light that fire and continue to give us that passion to move forward and continue to expose the corruption that's happening in Phoenix.
Yeah, thank you, Glo. Yeah, I mean, the audacity, right, of, mediocre white men. And like, that's what they showed up and went speak, and Kate Gallego, right? And Kate Gallego, I mean, I've seen one interview, and it was about how the officers feel. It was about what they're feeling. And I remember one of the police union reps said that they were frustrated and appalled that this report came out without letting them see it first, right? And it's like, are you fucking serious? Like, you are appalled about the report not coming to you and the report being out public. That's what they were appalled about, not about the shit they did, not about like the violence, no accountability, no honesty. And not only that, but kind of what you shared, Lola, like continuous cover up. They are covering up this idea, right? They're covering up and saying that they're a different department. They are absolutely not a different department. They have talked about all of the changes. They haven't really done those changes. Oh, let me see. They haven't done those changes, but even the few that were pushed through, they were fights. Like, they are talking about, oh, we put OAT in place. One, OAT is completely gutted. It does nothing anymore. But two, you never wanted that. And that was a multi-year fight, right? To even do some level of anything. I think what you were talking about, Keisha, was the Ames family in 2019. There was that huge community listening session, right? Thousands of people showed up, over 2,000 people showed up. Story after story after story of violence, of abuse. And in that moment, I remember at the end of that meeting, Kate Gallego said, we're going to do more. We want to listen to community. Never again heard from her. Now in this most recent round, she's talking about doing community listening sessions again, and that she wants to hear from community. It's like, no, like that's bullshit. Like, how, one, you're probably not going to do it because you're a straight up liar, and you literally said you were going to do that in 2019 and didn't, even though you said that to over 2,000 people and the media. And she's saying that again, right? And so we've seen that, the very hand in hand collaboration, and kind of, I think, what you were talking about earlier with MCAO, like the deep collusion to hide and to protect violence. And so we're seeing that again. You know, we're seeing that with the city and the police union, locked in on like some messaging on lies, on denying not one admission, not one acceptance, not one anything, right? And so I think that was, again, not surprising, but I think people really do need to pay attention to that. One of their biggest departments for the police is their comms department, and they're putting that, like, they spend so much money from our community in comms and in their messaging, right? And their story right now is, this department is not us anymore. We've changed. And we don't need any, like, we can be trusted to change. And oh, police morale is so low, like this is not okay. And it's all about the police, and it's exactly what we've seen every single day. Why we've said this department is not to be trusted. K Gallego is not to be trusted. This council is not to be trusted, because they are not, again, in this moment with all of this data, 125 pages. How dare they say we need to make sure we read into this and look into this? It's like, these are your documents. Like, you've had this, and not only that, but you've been told this. You were talking about all the political prosecutions and all the times we went to council throughout the last 10 years. They're straight up going around and pretending they need more time, and that they don't know what's in this report. It's infuriating. It's extremely disrespectful. It is harmful. It is harmful for the families to hear this continuous denial. But kind of what you said, Go, like, we're fucking committed. Like, we, like, beyond them, right? Like, our communities continue to be here. We're going to continue to show up and fight, and to make sure that they don't get away with this again, and that we don't allow their narrative to just continue. And as they, again, talk about how that this is not them, and that they are different, and also take no accountability. So I don't know, Steve, what about you? What have you seen in the responses?
So for me, there's this huge matter that Lola touched on earlier of the lies that are documented in this report, which we all knew was kind of happening when it was happening. But then there's the lies that are happening right now in front of us, because we have a city leadership led by Mayor Kate Gallego that has been telling us now for years, we're cooperating, we support the DOJ, we welcome the DOJ. And then this report shows, oh, that's all horseshit. That wasn't actually happening. And Lola touched on that. You know, they're not providing reports. They're not making people available for interviews. They're telling the public they're supporting it, while behind the scenes doing everything they can to frustrate it, especially on these First Amendment cases. But then there's a bigger issue happening, as I see it, which is this kind of implicit lie of, like, we can be trusted, which they also are saying now. We can be trusted, just accept the fact that we've changed. And we look in this report, and what we see is, we know their use of force policy changed during the course of this investigation. And we look in this report and we see that the Phoenix Police Department did not provide data to the DOJ after the end of 2022. So for 2023 and 2024, the DOJ said it relied on body cam footage, which police generally know how to manage that to make sure bad stuff doesn't show up on body cams, and, wait for it, critical incident briefings. Critical incident briefings, which are propaganda videos put out by the Public Information Office, one of which from August 9th, 2020, showed by the Phoenix Police Department's representation, showed protesters committing aggravated assaults that the DOJ in its report said never happened. So this is what the city of Phoenix left the DOJ to use for its determination of whether these reforms that it's self-instituting are actually working or not. So there's just this matter of trust. And Lola, you mentioned the $1 million they've spent. Early on in this investigation, months into it, the city of Phoenix hired a guy named Michael Bromwich, who is a partner at a big law firm called Steptoe and Johnson. Michael Bromwich isn't just a regular lawyer. He happens to be the former inspector general for the Department of Justice. What the inspector general does, I had to look this up because I didn't even know. The inspector general controls the finances of the Department of Justice and is responsible for making sure that finances are appropriated accordingly, and that attorneys are not spending too much money on, say, practice patterns and practices investigations. So they hired someone who basically everybody at the DOJ would fear while he was there, because no one wants to get audited. No one wants their budget taken away. He knows where the bodies are buried at the DOJ. And he presumably was hired to steer this investigation as he could. And his law firm got paid $1.36 million of taxpayer money to do that. That's what's happening right in front of our eyes right now that isn't in this report. And that for me is the most outrageous part of it, is they are literally lying to the public right now, saying they're cooperating while doing everything they can to avoid actual accountability, which is, no shock to anyone on this call. But I think the public really should be outraged by this. And I hope that message, I just published an article on Medium today to try to get the message out there a little bit, because I just think it's so outrageous what the city is trying to peddle to the people of Phoenix and the state of Arizona.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And yeah, maybe we can drop that link to that article, because yeah, it's like there's the report, right? Kind of what you're saying, Steve, straight up shows the lies. Like, the police report said this is actually the truth, or what happened, the video or whatever, third cameras. And then we have, again, what you're saying, the lies to us right now in our face that are happening like right now. And so for us, like, as we move into closing, thanks everyone for being here. We're going to this, like, kind of what's next, and what are we doing? So, like, as organizations, as community members that we've been committed in fighting against state violence, this is why, and everything, this report, I think folks, should read it to continue to see if, you don't have to read it. You already know everything, actually. And this gave us a synopsis. But why we say, right, that the only way forward is abolition. The DOJ report, they started putting out some very extremely reforms, right, around what they're going to do, or what they should do, including more training, including more data, right? Like, those things where we know, the data sure helps us see things, but it's ultimately not stopping police violence. It's ultimately not stopping this department from, exercising everyday violence every single day. Because again, policing is not broken, and as we know, this is what it was designed. So there, for us as BLM, right, there is no combination of trainings and policies and leadership, right, that is going to end the police violence, especially when this is what we're hearing, especially as you hear them parade and avoid any level of accountability. So, into that, kind of echoing what you shared earlier, Lola, like, so where are we with like a consent decree or these different things? So for us, like, the only way that this DOJ report or consent decree is something that we can be part of is if we can get to a place where that whatever the mandated changes reduce the role, the size, the scope, the scale, right, and the funding of this department. If it doesn't do those things, then what we're going to have is a continued violence department, continued violence in our community, but just more trained and more tools. The last thing to say to this, and I forgot who mentioned it, but in 2016, why these more training isn't going to help. In 2016, the DOJ actually gave recognition to the police. I don't know if y'all remember that, in the police department, to Phoenix police, they were commending them and gave them, recognition for their de-escalation training. That was in 2016. Right. And so it's like, what has changed from then to now? Nothing. same training, right? But it was like in this moment that because community came together and we were exposing the violence, right? But if it were up to, again, the DOJ, they literally awarded the Phoenix Police Department um, as a model department on de-escalation training. And now here we are reading these levels of uh, violence and lack of de-escalation. So just wanted to say that and like show that as an like say that as an example of why we say it's not more fucking training and like those things are not going to work. And also that you know, or more policies or their policy changes. So I guess that's what I'll say, but I'll pass it over to you, Lola.
Thanks, Vita. Yeah, everything snaps to that. I think for us, where we go from here, we have to realize that families who have been brutalized by police and families who've lost their family members that have been killed by police, um, a lot of them call for arresting and caging killer cops, and it's because they have no other recourse in the system that we're currently trapped in. And while we understand that families need some type of accountability for such harm, as abolitionists, we don't actually believe that you can call for the arrest or the caging of killer cops as a transformational or like viable solution to police violence. And it's a real tension because we have to acknowledge that right now, as we work to dismantle the system, there just aren't other solutions. And so family members feel as though that is their only choice. But we've learned some lessons, right? We believe that caging people is never going to be an answer. Um, and so we don't call for single cops to be arrested or incarcerated because it's not an isolated incident. It's not just like one bad apple. Caging a single cop isn't going to end police violence. But we also don't want to empower the system or the violent mechanisms within the system. It means that we can't expand prosecutorial or police power or prisons in any way, shape, or form. And that any harm that police cause to family members or anyone else, we just can't rely on systems of punishment to address it. So, so for us, it's been really, it's just really important that while we're holding up families and their needs and their feelings and their expressions, that we're also just very clear, right? The system isn't broken. It was designed this way, and it's a systemic problem. It has to be addressed with a systemic solution. Regarding consent decrees, as an abolitionist community and as institutional organizers, we're always seeking opportunities to shrink the power of the state to do its harm, and we use the tools that we have to that end. Contemporary abolitionist author Miriam Kaba, she tells us, and she reminds us that we must always perform 1,000,000 experiments to get to abolition. So we don't accept the DOJ's suggestion that a consent decree is going to be a solution to end police violence. But we know for sure that consent decrees, if left in the hands of the DOJ to negotiate alone without community support or input or whatever, it's only ever going to expand the police budget. It's only ever going to expand the police jurisdiction. So we know that if we, the community, also engage in the process of implementing a consent decree, that we're also going to never have the power to enforce any of our own demands. And at best, it's really going to just create a false sense of hope by the community that we're actually going to affect a change. History has really only ever shown us that consent decrees only ever result in, or never result in less violence, only result in more money and more power for the police. If we don't really figure out what to do soon, though, as a community, they are going to decide for us. We're working against the clock to interpret this political moment to decide how, as a community, we're going to interrupt the process and demand accountability on our terms. I think the only hope we have right now is, if we want our community to be safer, is to strip the police of their power. We can't expand it. One school of abolitionist thought, and this is really interesting, and this is going to lead us to another conversation, I believe, is the idea that a consent decree can actually strip the power of police through jurisdiction stripping. So jurisdiction stripping is when you remove the police department's ability to act in a certain area of public safety, whether it's going to be school disciplinary calls, mental health crises, traffic enforcement, any specific domain. And we're not really convinced at Maslib AZ that a consent decree can be used this way, but it is a school of thought. So we, instead of saying no, we say not yet. But if we're to perform a million experiments, we're going to have to remain open. We're going to have to be inviting new abolitionist thought. We're going to need to explore all possibilities. And in order to explore those new ideas and options, we're all going to have to come together. Like, it's going to take all of us. Maslib AZ has a value that says all of us or none of us. One thing the state depends on is for us to be individuals who depend solely on the state for solutions. And the first step of implementing an abolitionist outcome is to disrupt that, to band together, right? To be together. So this is an invitation. When we talk about what's next, where do we go from here? We need all hands on deck to support the planning of what's next, to explore what we can do as a community to seize this political movement and this political moment and move the needle. We can't allow ourselves to end up like Ferguson, Baltimore, Chicago, Albuquerque, all of these places that consent decrees came in and the DOJ just increased the harm, didn't decrease the violence. So in the coming weeks, there's going to be teach-ins. I know Poderi talking about teach-ins, BLM's talking about holding workshops and getting people together. We can use the elections to apply pressure. You just got to join us. So for Maslib, you can go to our link tree. It's not link tree because they support genocide. It's campsite. We changed. So you can go to our link in our bio. You can look for our volunteer form. We also did link Steve's article in there as well. I think that our partners are going to also have links that you can join. But join us. Become part of the movement. This is an all hands on deck opportunity. And the only other thing I'm going to say is, in the meantime, be really critical when you listen to the news. Listen to the questions the media is asking. Listen to the framing. We need to be discerning, because the reporting that's happening right now on the DOJ report is largely designed to paint the police as victims of their own violence. Look at the elections. They're in full swing. We're going to see another cover-up coming. Look at Ansari, who's ditching the city council after she made a colossal mess of District 7, and she's going to Congress. Look at the candidates for City District 7. Look at who they're going to be replacing Ansari. Look at the campaign for City District 5, where a cop is running against the current city councilwoman. Look at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Rachel Mitchell is running, right? And they were left out of the report, but they're total huge players. All of the actions of these politicians are going to be carefully calculated with the aim of winning elections, and it's not going to be about public safety. Let's use this political moment to clap back and regain power. We have built up power. This movement built up a ton of power. It had the power to build the smoke for DOJ to even come. Let's not surrender it in this moment. Let's lean in and let's get working so that we can push back and use this political moment. How about you, Glo?
Yeah, that was such a great, that should have been the closing, but anyway, good. Thank you for that. Yeah, I don't have much else to offer. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, we are in actively working on a campaign for Jacob Harris and the Phoenix 3, and also we'll be continuing to support this work around the DOJ and trying to continue this effort forward. I love there's some comments in the chat about ideas and thoughts around how we can do that I think are really great, around going after the insurance companies who insure police officers. I don't know if that's a viable option, but it's definitely a great thought, a great school of thought that we can consider. Definitely get involved. You can find BLM Phx Metro either at BLM Phx Metro on IG, on all platforms, IG, our Instagram. Sorry, IG, our website is blmphxmetro.org. You can reach out, get involved. If you're interested in learning more about the Jacob Harris campaign, there's definitely more information about that. You can get involved with that as well. I do want to highlight a couple of demands that came directly from Roland Harris, Jacob Harris's father. And there's quite a few demands here. I'm only going to highlight a couple of them. And one of them is to file a lawsuit against the city for the violations of civil rights on behalf of the victims and their families, and force the city to pay restitution to those families, to provide mental health counseling and services for the victims and their families of for the victims and families of police brutality, and treat them as victims and provide them services and rights as victims. And then also allowing making all disciplinary reports on officers permanent public record so that we can have access to that data, which makes it easier for us to find out if a corrupt cop is the one who, I mean, all cops are corrupt in some way, right? But figuring out the level of their corruption, if we have had a family member who's been a victim of police brutality. So there's quite a few here. Maybe we'll post them. We'll create maybe a draft and post them later. But I just wanted to highlight a few of those demands coming straight from Roland Harris. And then, yeah, continue to get involved. Continue to follow our work. Show up to our events. Come get involved. You cannot be a passive participant in this movement, because this is not just a movement for right now. This is not just a moment, right? This has been a decade-long fight. Sorry, multiple decade-long fight for us as Black people to try to just gain humanity in this country, let alone civil rights, let alone equal treatment, let alone equity, right? But we're seeing it internationally, right? Expand your internationalism lens. Expand your lens into seeing what's happening and pay attention to what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Cuba, right? What's happening in Puerto Rico. All of those struggles are interconnected, and they impact what's happening here locally. What we're seeing here locally is just a small microcosm of what's happening around the world. We're just not seeing it. We're just getting a small taste of what's happening, but in other countries, entire communities are being completely destroyed because of the ways in which corruption is flourishing because there's no spotlight on it, right? So the more that we can put a spotlight on the corruption that's happening, not only here in our local communities, but also in our international communities, the more and more they can't hide, and the more and more we gain and we pull back that power that they currently have. And so get involved. Don't be a passive participant, because then you're complacent and you are part of the problem. So don't be part of the problem. Be part of the solution.
Thank you, Claude. And then with that, just that a very clear reminder, right? This department is trained by the IDF as well. I don't think we mentioned that, but like this violence, right? From same weapons to same tools to same tactics of violence. So I wanted to just add that. There's only one question and then we'll wrap up. But I think maybe for you, Steve, there was a question around like who brought Bromwich to was it the city as a whole? Was it the city manager? Was it the mayor?
I don't know the answer to that question. My suspicion would be it was the city manager, just the way the government tends to work at the city, but I don't know the answer to that. I do know that it was first reported in May of 2022, but the city's first checks to Steptoe and Johnson, according to their public records, were March of 2022. So he had been hired for a couple months before the media even heard about it. It was not something that was publicly announced. There was no press conference. It was very much behind the scenes until I think ABC 15 found out about it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think also that, right? Like the continued audacity and just like complete disregard to communities, continue to use our money, like literally our funds to cover up this violence, to immediately move into covering up, right? They started the cover up over 3 years ago. And so this is like just that continues. So yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in, everyone of 30 folks that stayed throughout. Thank y'all. If you have questions, this is going to be posted so you can share the live, but you can also contact our pages directly. And yeah, thank y'all everyone for joining. Lola, Chloe, Steve, it's so good to be in space with y'all. So with that, I think that's it. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Wait, for good measure. Wait, before you go, for good measure, one good time. It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty
to win.
We must love and protect each other.
We must love and protect each other.
Because we have nothing to lose but our chains.
We've got nothing to lose but our chains.
So with that, peace,
Thank you,
y'all.
Peace.